Well, our guests have started to arrive, so I'd like to start and introduce this session. Thank you everyone for coming to the Stay at Home Festival. We've had such a lovely week and a bit now of lovely bookish events and conversations, and everyone's been so generous with their time and their comments, and I hope you will enjoy this session. Jill, if you would like to start us off.
Thanks very much, Joanna, and to the Stay at Home Literary Festival for inviting us to come and do a session about Me Too, the women's poetry anthology, which is rallying against sexual assault and harassment. It is published by Fairacre Press. It was published in 2018, and it's also available from the festival bookseller. So I'm Jill Abram, and I will be joined by 4 other poets for this session. We're rather sad because we were supposed to be joined by 5, but Jill Mill Breckenridge is in Delhi, and so it would appear that she's not been able to join us, but we will bring her into the room in spirit a little bit later on. The proceeds from this event, and indeed all the proceeds from the book, went to or go to Women's Aid, a charity supporting women in crisis. We will be having a Q&A later on, so if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. So by way of introduction to the poets, and if you like to show our credentials, each of us is going to read our own poems from the book. If you're reading along in the book, I'll give you the page numbers, and Kim is going to screen share, so if you don't have the book and want to read along, you can do that. So we're going to start with the writer and editor, Wendy Pratt, who's going to read her poem on page 14. Oh, sorry, Wendy, before you start, I should just remind you that it probably won't surprise you, given the subject of this session, #MeToo, that I should give you a content warning that there are depictions of violence and harassment, including sexual violence and domestic abuse. So if you need to drop out or anything like that, please just go. You must look after yourselves. That's a priority. Sorry to interrupt. Wendy, page 14.
Thank you.
Sorry, Wendy, I'm going to interrupt now. Just before I screen share, just to explain, the poem's coming up on the screen now. If anybody wants to see Wendy's face, instead of reading the poem, you can just hover your cursor between the text of the poem and Wendy's face and stretch one or the other, so you don't have to read along if you don't want to. Sorry, Wendy.
Sounds terrible. I don't want my face stretching. Okay, so this is really nice. Firstly, it's very nice to be here and to be part of this continued conversation around this subject, which is so necessary and so important to keep in the eye of the public and the world. This poem that I'm going to read is really about sexualisation of girls and at what point that happens. So this is Reeds. This is 1988, a disused quarry, the pits, a mix of chalk and shale, now filled with green water, geese and ducks. Men fish here. 2 wild 10-year-olds at the edge strip to cozies. Underneath, their shorts dip in. The water, like brain freeze, becomes the norm. Rocks are sharp as kitten teeth. Reeds, soft fingers. The green, blue, beautiful. The sun is a thumbprint. One dips underneath. The other is on the shore, drying herself, pulling on shorts over thin, white, goose-bumped legs, while the men watch and fish. Thank you.
The next poem is on page 19 and will be read by its writer, Victoria Bennett, who is also the founder of Wild Women, which we'll hear a little bit more about shortly.
Thanks, Jill. I'm sharing this poem because for me, it kind of depicts the first instance where I experienced sexual exposure, sexual harassment, and had nothing done about it by adults around me. Dog. At first, he seems nice, just a man with a beard walking his dog. Only there is no dog, and there is a wood, and the dog has run off, and could we help him find it, please? My cousin is 7, with fizzy red hair, and she says, yeah, okay, what's he called? Rex, he says, after a really long time, and I think, no, we mustn't go into the wood to look for the dog. And I am 8 and oldest, so I say, no, I don't think so. And he says, have you seen one of these? His jeans are undone and he's pulling, and I say, yeah, sure, my dad has one, but it isn't as big. And he pulls harder and says, would you like to touch it? And I say, no way. So he grabs my wrist and his face twists and it burns, and the voice in my head that sounds a lot like Mum shouts, run! And we run so fast my heart is thumping, and I'm shouting at my cousin, hurry up! And she stops and says, but what about the dog? Thank you.
Our next poet is Kim Moore, or I should say Dr. Kim Moore, because she recently published was awarded a PhD in poetry and everyday sexism, and her poem is on page 42.
Thanks, Jill. So this poem was one of the poems I wrote as part of my PhD study, which was trying to write about moments of sexism. And really I suppose it's also looking at how we can be complicit in those moments as well, and the difficulties of writing about that. So I have been a long time without thinking. The mind as an empty and flooded field. The mind as water that rises up through the green. The mind as the tree at the edge of the field. I have been a long time without thinking. White birds with no names. They row away through the air. I have been a long time without thoughts of my own. They built a fence round the field. They named the trees and the birds. They told me to walk up and down. If I did it, they cheered. I am reading in the place that they built. Adrian Rich said, read as if your life depended on it. A man asks me what I'm reading. He tells me about his job and his wife and his children. I put my book away. Repeat, repeat. I put my book away. He tells me about money and Brexit and immigration. I've been putting my book away all my life. I put away my hands and my mouth and my eyes. I can sit here and listen and live without field or water or green, or go back and fold into myself, or enter the field and drink at the flooded place, or enter and prepare to be followed, or not. I am worried that they made the field. Maybe they gave me the water. I am worried about madness in the next 60 seconds. I put away my heart and the stillness inside. I smile and say, so what do you do? Tell me again. And how many kids do you have? Remind me again of your wife.
Thank you, Kim. And now Deborah Alma, who has edited this anthology and runs the Poetry Pharmacy in Shropshire, instead of reading her own poem, has chosen to read Jill Mill's poem, which I think is lovely. And as I said, we would bring her into the space. This is on page 67 in the book.
Thank you, Jill. Button. Persuaded to try medication, few side effects, no problem. Dr. Attle smiles at my husband. You are just a possession, a car to service, a house to maintain. He proudly leads you home. 10 milligrams of this and that, and a brand new wife. Your voice does not matter, the thickening tongue, the diminishing libido. your body not your own, your limbs swim in treacle, your mind anaesthetized, your smile pasted. The new improved wife, model 101, will last without complaint. Just press the button.
Thanks for reading that, Deb, and we hope all is well with Jill Mill in Delhi. I'm now going to read my own poem, which is on page 83. Excuse me. Ending it. Today, I didn't send the children to their room as knots formed in my belly at the sound of your key in the door. I didn't scan for warning signs in your eyes, on your breath, how you moved, cover bruises with makeup and lies. I didn't grill your pork chop just so, smooth every lump from your mash for you to throw the plate across the room. I didn't bounce off the wall from the fist I didn't see coming, feel your hands around my throat, lose my breath. I didn't pretend to be asleep as you came up to bed, hoping you wouldn't drag me out by my hair, get in with me to do worse. I didn't bleed from my busted nose, losing our baby which you kicked out of me, yelling that it wasn't yours. Last night, I put a knife under my pillow. Tomorrow, I will hold my head up. And we couldn't have Dog without the companion poem. So here's Vic reading her poem on page 84.
Thank you, Jill. And it is a companion poem because, if anything, this marks the point in my life after a couple of decades, really, of experiencing abuse, of saying, no, I've had enough. Cat. When he beats the kitten to death, I pretend not to see. It's just a cat, not me. And anyway, he wants to marry me, even though he knows I am broken. He's normal. That's what I like. Everything will be better. And for a while it is, so long as I behave. But I'm not good at being good. And one night, me and the guys stay late at the bar after my shift and down a few pints, have a laugh. Nothing more. But he doesn't like this. And he grabs my hair and hisses in my ear. Stop behaving like a whore and start behaving like my wife. And I say, good night to the guys who are looking at the floor. And later on he says, it's for your own good, you'll learn. So I don't go back to my shift. Mostly I have to stay quiet and cook him meat and have sex. It could be love if I don't forget. I ring home each week. Oh, love, best to let it lie. And I do. I lie and lie and lie. And when things break, I clean them up and stay home and hide in the loo and write. And one day the words walk me right out of the door and I run with them. But I forget to hide. And soon he comes with a knife and he's shouting, bitch, you can't leave. But he's drunk and I'm sober. And I get the hell out of there all the way to the police, who give me a cup of sweet tea. And I tell them about the words and the knife and being quiet. And the policeman tells me, if he does it again, call this number. And I tell him, if he does it again, I'll be dead. I remember the kitten then, and the way its tongue hung out of its crushed head, and I get up and I walk away. Because I'm broken, I know, but that's okay. Because I'm not a kitten. I'm a woman, and I'm fucking strong. Thank you.
Thank you all for the poems, and thanks to Kim as well for doing the screen share. So I'm just going to tell you, in case you don't know, very briefly about the hashtag #MeToo. It was first coined in 2006 by New Yorker Tarana Burke, to empower women who had endured sexual violence by letting them know that they weren't alone. And then in 2017, so it'd been going a long time before that, prompted by a New York Times article in which Harvey Weinstein was accused of sexual harassment, it was used by actress Alyssa Milano. Other high-profile women joined in, so it took off that time. And in the next few weeks, that hashtag was used more than 12 million times. And obviously, you know, that's several years ago, so it's probably countless by now. So it's starting to break the silence and empower women to come forward. It's led to some perpetrators being brought to justice and other things like this book. So Deborah, how or why did this anthology come about?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jill. I'm a bit of a Facebook addict, and I remember in all of that kind of news stuff about the Harvey Weinstein allegations that women were being interviewed, women in the media or journalists and fellow journalists, the men were asking these women, their colleagues and people they were interviewing, has this happened to you? And the women laughing and saying, well, of course, you know, and all of us women watching and thinking, yes, it's happened to me again and again. And so I asked the question on Facebook, who amongst us hasn't experienced something? Because I was amazed that men didn't seem to realise that it was all of us. And I think I had about 200 different responses, 200 different women. And of 200, I think 2 or 3 only have said it hadn't happened to them. And then during the course of the conversation that ensued, realised actually that it had happened to them as well. So, and on that thread, someone suggested that we collect our stories because necessarily we started sharing these stories. And I'm a poet and an editor, and it was obvious to me that the best way to collect these stories, or the thing that I could do, was to collect them into an anthology.
Great. And so this wonderful book, the Blue Book, as we refer to it, happened, and something else happened. Hashtag us together on Wild Women. So Vic, can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was one of the people that was I saw Deb's first Facebook post and felt an enormous sense of relief actually when I started to see these and that sounds strange. I felt an enormous sense of relief when I saw all these women coming forward and realised I could come forward too. But obviously, in conversation with Deb as the submissions started coming in, it was obvious that they couldn't all fit into one book. I mean, how many? I think there were over 600 submissions, and it was a very short amount of time that people could put the submissions in. So I offered to support the book as best as could through Wild Women Press by giving an online space to the poems that couldn't fit in, but that the stories needed to be told and being given that space and respect to be heard. And then as we started to do readings through the year, I invited people to send in their own stories, their own poems if they wanted to, you know, either in response to reading the anthology or coming to an event, or just, you know, as part of being sort of wanting to share their stories. So it was just a wider space for that conversation to spread out and continue.
And those poems are still up on the Wild Women Press website. People can go and read those. And you mentioned readings. There are a number of readings. Deb, I imagine you probably did more than anybody as the creator of the anthology. What was the experience like, and what sort of responses did you get from the audience?
Thinking about this today, I went back to my diary from 2018, and I think I did about 17 live events all over the country, and there were lots of radio interviews and articles, and but yeah, the experience of the readings was absolutely extraordinary. They felt really important, moving, valuable, kind of empowering gatherings of women with men respectfully listening, but lots of shared stories, lots of mutual support, really difficult and moving as well, but it was extraordinary, amazing year actually.
And Kim, you've written more on this subject, and I think I was at the first reading of the poems from the sequence on domestic violence in your first book. What are the responses like when you read on this subject at a non-Me Too event, when people aren't necessarily expecting it?
Yeah, I became really interested in that space because I went to an amazing event with Sarah Ahmed, and I looked around the room. I think she was reading from Living a Feminist Life, and I looked around the room, and there was, you know, of 300 people in the room, I think there was about 3 men there. So often if you say that you're going to speak about sexism, is a very self-selecting audience. So I'm interested in, I don't say normally that I'm going to read poems about sexism. I'm just giving a poetry reading, and what happens when you kind of spring that on people. And I don't mean kind of missing out trigger warnings, but just talking about sexism. And I had some really interesting responses from men and women, and you know, I had a lot of women coming up and saying, as I'm sure Deb did at the Me Too events, this has happened to me, this has made me think differently about experiences that I've kind of put to the back of my mind. But one of the interesting things for me that came out of writing about experiences of sexism was the things that I would dismiss as something small, that isn't, you know, something that I haven't really thought about, like, I don't know, being 15 and someone, a grown man kind of grabbing my leg. It hasn't traumatized me. I still leave the house and walk around and do everything, but I've remembered that, and I'm nearly 40 now, and I'll always remember it, I think. So what happens when you put that moment in the space of a poem, and give the white space of the poem to that? It suddenly elevates it. It becomes something that you can't minimize or say is nothing. It becomes something that becomes, you can feel the kind of importance and the impact of it, I guess. So I think that gets a little bit off your question, which was about readings, but yeah.
Still interesting though. And you talked about the different responses from men and women, and Wendy, you're a magazine editor, so you're getting lots of submissions of single poems, I guess, coming in. What's the difference between how men and women present the work that they're writing?
It's very interesting what everyone's saying about these small instances that we don't realise add to the bigger picture. On the Me Too has caused this huge wave within society, and it sort of makes you look at things slightly differently, even down to what you are doing as a woman working in the creative arts and working in the industry, and how small things that I hadn't noticed before, like being in a room where I'm the only woman poet and sort of being sidelined because of that. This, as a magazine editor, one of the things that I noticed recently was that when women submit work to the magazine, and I get mostly women submitting work to the magazine, I do genuinely think this is because I'm a woman editor, they submit almost like they're apologising for taking up your time and sending you the work, whereas on the whole, men are so much more confident. In fact, on the whole, the people that don't follow the submissions guidelines tend to be men, and they just approach you and say, hi, you're going to be interested in these poems because they're absolutely brilliant. Here they are, poem, bye, see you. Whereas the women approach you like, hi, I'm really sorry, I've got these poems. Don't worry about it if you've not got time. And I think that is part of the sort of permissions that we are giving from ourselves, because it's so normalized in society for women to be in this position. We're sort of almost giving permission for this to carry on a wider scale, on a bigger scale, because it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's grown. This sort of behavior is grown, and unless we look at where that growth is coming from, nothing's ever going to really change.
I think it's time to hear some more poems. So now we're going to read some poems by other people in the book. And we're going to start, Kim's going to read a poem that is on page 54.
Okay, so this is The Bicycle by Katrina Naomi. I was okay. Nothing had happened. Nothing bad had happened. I couldn't get up from the bench, couldn't do up my dungarees. It was cold. It was night. The man had gone, and that was good. I was okay. I could sit up, peel myself from the bench's slats which had pressed deep inside. It could have been worse. I was shaking. It was night. The bicycle was too heavy. My dungarees kept slipping. Buttons were missing. I had to get home. It was so hard to walk. My head hurt, kept punching inside. My teeth couldn't stop talking. It could have been worse. My jaw hurt and my breasts were raw. I couldn't pick up the bicycle, its spinning wheel. Couldn't walk with the bicycle. I had to get home, to wash, sleep, throw these clothes away. I was shaking. I was cold. My dungarees wouldn't do up. I would be all right. It was just this bicycle I needed.
And if you turn over a couple of pages, Wendy's going to read the poem on page 56. At least you will if she unmutes. Wendy, you're muted.
Oh, rookie mistake. Sorry, I'll start again. Skinned by Zelda Chapel. In the corner, a boy peels my skin with a butter knife while I watch from the door. He wants it to spiral like orange peel. It feels like scales instead. He rarely talks. He chooses instead to stab the air slow and deliberately. This way he can be sure it registers. I am meticulous with accounts. I know the bottom line. He fingers my skin like a typewriter whose keys are jammed, writes letters that lack true eloquence. I cannot.
I think we just lost the last line there. I cannot feel a thing. And Deb is going to read two poems now. The first on page 62 and then page 144.
Just before I start this poem, it does mention Aziz Ansari, who was accused of inappropriate sexualized behavior to women. And so ironically, there he is sort of virtue signaling in this poem. But anyway, the poem's a good one. And it went viral actually at the time. So I was pleased to include it in the book. And it's called Now When I Think About Women by Emily Cernica. I think about Aziz Ansari's Netflix special, where he asked the ladies in the crowd how many had been followed, not catcalled, actually followed down the street by a man many blocks, and how nearly half of Madison Square Garden raised their hands. I was home raising my hand, thinking of moments in multiple cities, how it was suddenly time to be scared. Now, when I think about women, I think about educated men who ask if we secretly love being hollered at. Don't you kind of enjoy the attention? Isn't it flattering? It is 2017, and my best friend says, a man in a car pulled up beside me as I was bicycling. He was jerking off at me, to me. I froze, had to force myself to start pedaling away. Last October, I consoled my most enthusiastic canvassers, girls who were chased and assaulted whilst trying to get out the vote for the first female president. Now, when I think about women, I think about violence and the threat of violence, how it's like an alarm inside going from 0 to blaring. The week I moved to New York, a girl my age went for a run. People said it was her fault for dressing that way, not taking that path. The article said there was evidence of a struggle, that before she died, the attacker, sorry, can you scroll up? Sorry, that before she died, she bit her attacker so hard her teeth cracked. I'm particularly pleased to read this poem. It's the penultimate poem in the book by Ros Goddard. And Ros actually, she knew about the call for the book, call out for the book, and she's a good friend of mine, and she wrote it for me, and it's called This Poem Is For You. Carrying a bale of warm towels, house low lit, quiet, a great silence recently come to my heart. A long quiet, such as one might find buried in a seam of coal. I think of your darkness far away, weightless as a crane fly. On the stairs, I stop halfway and remember, as every so often I must do, of being scattered in the tread of your boot, of women gathering me in boat arms, attending there as one dawn gave way to another until I was strong. I remember, and though my front is soft as lawn, as milk, a buried lesson is diamond in my bones and seems to shine.
Thank you. Now, we know it's not all men, but as Deb said, it is almost all women. One of the largest ever studies on violence committed against women and girls in the UK was published last week by Victim Focus. It surveyed over 20,000 women, and more than 99.7% had been subjected to violence, and sexual assault was higher than physical assault, but over 20% of those women had been thrown down the stairs. So what's changed since Me Too took off in 2017? Well, it would seem that not very much. Only last week, somebody else in the film industry, Noel Clarke, a producer, director, writer, actor, in other words, very influential, was suspended by BAFTA and had his award withdrawn, which he'd only been given about 3 weeks earlier, I think. Now, what I find very interesting about this is when BAFTA announced that they were going to give him the award, a number of allegations were made against him, but they were all anonymous or third party, and they felt that they weren't able to investigate or to do anything. When the award was actually bestowed upon him, 20 women who knew him in a professional capacity put their names to allegations of sexual harassment, unwanted touching or groping, sexually inappropriate behaviour and comments on set, professional misconduct, talking and sharing sexually explicit pictures and videos without consent, and bullying, all between 2004 and 2019. And this was reported in The Guardian just last week. He denies all of the accounts against him. But the question I want to put to the panel now is, given that those 20 women fairly quickly decided to put their names to the allegations, do you think that women are feeling more empowered to come forward? And has the whole Me Too movement enabled that?
I think as a general thing, I think women are maybe speaking out more. I think what's interesting about going back to the Victim Focus research is, I was reading, it's quite long and I haven't read all of it, but I was reading the questions that they used, and they actually broke down the question, have you experienced sexual assault, and listed different types of assault, so groping, catcalling, and you ticked a box to say which one, being hit, thrown down the stairs, pushed, and you ticked a box to say which one you'd experienced. And one of the reasons for doing that is because women often don't describe what happens to them as sexual assault. We don't think of it as sexual assault, because to think of it as sexual assault is actually really upsetting and traumatizing and disturbing. It can be as traumatizing as it happening in the first place to name it that. So I thought it was really interesting that the research broke those categories down, and I think that's why the findings are so stark and so surprising to some people. To say 99.3% of women have experienced these things, I think it's because they named those things that happened. So yeah, I think women are coming forward more. That I work with a lot of young girls, and I'm really shocked by the stories that they tell me. So I think it's all still happening exactly the same, but the thing that gives me hope is that the young girls, they know what's happening to them, they can name it, they can articulate it, and I think that's the first step to what Bell Hooks would call critical consciousness, which is not just being aware of what happens, but working out what the groundwork is that makes those things able to happen, that creates that landscape that those things can happen in.
Yes, I went to the launch of that report, and they talked about how by asking those specific questions they got these answers, and they gave such a contrast that I think it's the crime, the big crime report that gets published every so often that gives the government the statistics in England and Wales. The question they ask is, have you ever been sexually interfered with? Who's going to say I've been sexually interfered with? But if you say, have you been touched in this way? Have you been kissed without consent? Have you had very specific questions? Deb, what do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kim that what's happening on one hand is that women are noticing the micro aggressions more than they might have done before, and I'm not sure that they're quite confident enough to call them out there. And when it's a difficult thing to do, we're so socialized to be nice and polite, not to move into conflict, and we're frightened of conflict that it's difficult even with the microaggressions to say stop. But we talk amongst ourselves, we use social media, it's out there much more, but I'm still really angry and really depressed. I read today that of only 1.4% of reported rape challenges result in a charge. So 1.4, so justice to women in rape cases, only 1.4% of those women are getting justice. And I was absolutely horrified and enraged and angry again. And so on the one hand, there's good news, and on the other, in this country, we're certainly not doing enough.
Yeah, the domestic abuse bill was passed in Parliament last week, and it creates a statutory definition of domestic abuse and emphasises that it's not just physical violence, but can also be emotional, coercive, controlling, and economic abuse. It also covers things like non-fatal strangulation, revenge porn, and the so-called rough sex gone wrong defence. So despite what you've said about the figures, does this bill mean that women should have more confidence that they're going to be taken more seriously when they come forward? Vic, would you like to say something on that? What do you think?
I think that there needs to be a fundamental culture change from the ground up. That so long as we live in a culture where women's lives are considered to be less valuable than men's lives, economically, socially, culturally, politically, until that changes, then the balance, the weight of power and the balance of power will lean towards there being situations like what Deb is saying, less cases reaching effective justice, women not necessarily feeling empowered to be able to extract themselves from situations or not get into situations. So I think there's a real ground level thing that has to change. It has to change in adults, it has to change in organisations, I mean, you look at, one of the things I noticed was, and this is very effective, and was very important to happen when the Black Lives Matter movement, really kind of said, right, this needs to be talked about. A lot of organisations came out and said, okay, what can we do better? We recognise we're not doing enough. What can we do better? So far, I haven't seen the same thing happen with organisations across the board in terms of women. What can we do better? What are we not managing to do? Where are we actually just, systematically applying this misogyny basically to our organisation and the way that we perceive things? So I think there has to be a fundamental change. And the other change I think that needs to happen is that it can't just be women. It can't just be women that confront these things. It can't just be women that call these things out. So for all the amount of things saying not all men, what needs to happen is every time a man sees another man, behaving in a way, inappropriate comments, however jokey, however light, however, whatever, any kind of behavior, they need to call it out, and they need to call it out then and there, so that it's not just women, because so long as it's just women, it can be written off as hysteria, moody, just sort of, not being able to take a joke. So it has to be everybody.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think often in a group, if one person states a strong opinion, everybody else is a bit afraid to step forward, whatever that opinion, whether it's on this subject or something else. But yeah, I think men really do need to step up and say that's not okay. And they might find that most of the men around them agree. Kim?
I think going back to the domestic violence question, this is a subject very close to my heart because I've experienced it and written about it. I experienced it for a year when I was a lot younger, but I think one of the things that would make a massive difference is education on the early warning signs of domestic violence, because we're socialized to think that those early warning signs are romantic. How many songs can we can all list the songs that talk about jealousy as this romantic, passionate thing, when actually jealousy is a really good early warning sign that something isn't right. Possessiveness, the early warning signs are kind of gone out of my head, but I think we need to go into schools and teach boys and girls what those early warning signs look like, so that they can recognize, because domestic violence is a really big problem in young people's relationships as well. So I think until that changes, because by the time it's domestic violence, it's too late, you're stuck, and it's really difficult to get out. And I don't think that has changed really, until I still don't think people really understand what domestic violence is, what it can look like. We read the extreme stories of women dying or nearly dying, when actually there's the majority of domestic violence cases are much more subtle than that, I think. So I would say that until that changes, that bill is not worth the paper that it's written on.
Women's Aid have got a statistic that says that 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence at some stage in their lives. That's a huge proportion of us. But for me, that because we're all the time looking for the solutions, and there are many things that we can do, and as women and that men can do. But for me, as a mother of 2 boys, it's been really interesting to watch how other people bring up their sons, and for me it's really it's almost a key thing. It's about how we bring up our children, and that we don't accept any violence whatsoever as a solution to a problem, that it's never okay. This thing of boys will be boys, and picking up sticks or hitting or any aggression, and that kind of sense of entitlement starts quite young. You know, and you were talking about young people, Kim, and I think that's where we need to look.
Yes, I think it's important to think about how we teach our children, how we teach our boys to behave differently, and also how you get the balance for girls until the world changes, that they must keep safe but without scaring them. Wendy, you have some experience or thoughts on how we teach our children?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't have children, so it's not, I feel slightly uncomfortable talking about how other people should bring up their children, because it's just something I wouldn't really know about. But what I do think it's important, as well as making sure that young people are looked after, that we give older people a space to talk as well. Kim works with a lot of young people. I actually work mostly with older women that are sort of in their 50s towards 60s and older actually as well. And one of the things I found in workshop environments, in closed workshop environments, is that whilst they would never ever go to the police about what's happened to them, they are starting, because of the Me Too movement, starting to be able to talk to each other about it and write about it and share these poems within this safe environment. So I think it's really important, one, that we don't put pressure on people to always declare their own experiences of these things, because it's so difficult to talk about. Trauma is so difficult to talk about, and not everybody can, and not everybody should have that responsibility to do that, but also to give these spaces where people can talk about it in a safe environment. For older women especially, who have lived within the confines of I want to say low-level domestic violence, but there is no low level really, is there? Or low-level sexual abuse within a family environment, and have lived with that for a long time. It's really important to have those spaces for older people, and to remember that they have experienced this themselves as well.
I think what you say, Wendy, about not expecting people to speak out about it is really important too. I really felt that with when the Sarah Everard awful case kind of happened and broke on the news. It felt like I had to switch it off, because I felt like I can't perform my trauma anymore. I can't say over and over again, this has happened, this has happened, this is happening now. I was just exhausted by it. And I think what you said is really important, that yes, we need to give a space, but we also need to not expect women to just keep saying the same things over and over. We do it when we've got the energy, and when we don't, we shouldn't feel guilty or like we're letting people down. But
yeah, thank you. We're coming towards the end of the session, and so I don't think there's any questions yet in the Q&A, but you've still got time to put them in. But we all discussed this session last week and decided that we wanted to end on a slightly more positive note. So we're thinking about how you look after yourself in a world designed for women. What are your personal survival tips, or what would you put in a personal survival kit to keep yourself safe? If you've got answers to that question, we'd really like you to put them into the chat. I see there is a question. I shall check that in a moment. So yes, if you've got any personal survival tips or items for a kit, please put that into the chat. And meantime, each of the poets here is going to tell us what's in their survival kit. Vic, would you like to start?
In my survival kit, I have a wonderful group of women called Wild Women. And we've met for 22 years this year. And for me, that's been so important to have a whole group of women of all different ages who can share their life experiences and who are there for me, whatever we're going through, good or bad. And that is very empowering, because we support each other's right to tell our stories and to be heard, and sometimes to not tell our stories too.
Wendy?
I think because I spend such a lot of time on social media, I really, really feel when there's a big event like the policing of women's spaces, and it is repeated and repeated and repeated within social media, it becomes very, very draining. You almost feel like you have to you want to be part of a movement that pushes back against that, but you also have to sort of step away and not be part of that as well. So one of the things that I do is to literally leave social media and leave the news and leave the internet and leave all of those connections to the wider world and go outside and just to be in nature and be around the wind and the earth and away from it, to sort of reset myself. And I think that's probably my biggest survival tip.
Kim?
I should just reference that this idea for the feminist survival kit comes from Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life. It's one of the big chapters she does at the end of the book, where this is her advice to get yourself a survival kit together. So I'm just going to read this is in my survival kit, and I return back to this quote over and over again. And I've mentioned bell hooks before, but I had to find a way of dealing with these responses to my own work about sexism, which would often be quite challenging from some members of the audience. And I found this quote by bell hooks, and it's carried me through all of that. So she's discussing her own desire for approval, and she says, "When I first began to talk publicly about my work, I would be disappointed when audiences were provoked and challenged but seemed to disapprove. Not only was my desire for approval naive, I have since come to understand that it is silly to think that one can challenge and also have approval. It was dangerous precisely because such a longing can undermine radical commitment, compelling a change in voice so as to gain regard." So I return back to that, and back to a radical commitment.
Thank you, Kim. Dan?
I'm going to post it in the chat, sorry.
Brilliant.
Yeah, all of the above in a way for my survival kit. I think my survival kit most of all is a kind of ranting one. So whether it's bloody getting my female friends and just swearing a lot and having that kind of collective strength by talking to other women, and that kind of sense of an arm in arm thing, walking with strength with other women is really important for me. And then there's something for me as well about action in one form or another. So the book was, I just wanted to do something. So the book was a piece of action, and this conversation is part of it, and saying yes to all of the opportunities that we get to talk about it. I always feel that I'm not very articulate, and I find things like this quite difficult, but we have to keep doing it even if we find it difficult. The poems are hard to read, they were hard to write, but we have to keep doing that, I think.
Thank you. And don't forget, if you want to put anything in the chat that's in your personal survival kit, please do. I think what I would say to answer that question, well, just one of those things, I follow a Twitter account called @onthisdayshe, and every day they tweet about a woman who has achieved something, and if she was a man, we'd probably know all about her. And they cover the entire range of history and present day. They cover evil people as well as good people, just the kind of people that we would know about if they were men. And so it's a bit frustrating sometimes when you look at it and think, God, if she was a man, we'd know about her, or why did that man take credit for her work? But every day there is a woman to celebrate, and that's a really positive way to start my day. So we are going to look now, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Alison Lester has said that in the US, women's aid organisations there experienced an unsettling silence during the worst months of the pandemic because women were stuck at home with abusers and didn't have the privacy necessary to call for help. And they, of course, now things are opening up, they're expecting a deluge of needs. Do you think the same is happening here in the UK? Do you think a new hashtag can be established for these women finding their way forward? While you guys are thinking about that, I just wanted to mention Henny Beaumont's Disappearing Women's project. As in the run-up to the domestic abuse bill debate, Jess Phillips stood up and named 118 women in Parliament who had been killed by men in the last year. And Henny, who is a poet as well as an artist, is now painting each and every one of those women. And if you live in London, you might have seen her last week on the BBC London local news. So Deb, do you think there's a new hashtag that can help women who are struggling?
That's on
being
the spot.
trapped in?
Yeah, maybe. I do know that Women's Aid have said there was a big escalation in domestic violence through the silent COVID times, but at the same time, 85% of the domestic abuse charities have had their services cut or in some way over the last year. So, you know, these years of austerity and this government austerity have got a lot to answer for. And I can't think of anything. I think I still think we should be angry and continue that anger. So maybe something ranty or anger. Ask somebody else. That'd be good.
Anybody else think can you think of a new hashtag to help?
I can't think of stuff like that, but I guess what occurred to me when you were talking about hashtags is, of course, hashtags only reach a certain part of the population. People that have a computer, people that are technologically literate. There's a whole raft of women that will be experiencing domestic violence that a hashtag wouldn't help with. So I guess it's holding that in our minds as well. But yeah, I think if someone's good at thinking of hashtags, then they should go for it.
I also think I just wanted to say that it becomes very convenient to start to use hashtags as a way of doing something about something without really doing something about it. Raising awareness, of course, is really important. But unless actual change is happening, it becomes a sort of a convenient way of just gathering stuff together and then just moving on. Well, we've done something about this and that's it. So I think making real change happen, it's so difficult, isn't it? It's so difficult to know what to do or how to help people in these situations. But there has to be, and it has to come down from the government downwards, really, doesn't it? And it has to be innovated by them. We can't, like we were saying earlier, we can't all just keep taking responsibility for the actions that should be made to protect us anyway, or something like that.
I think that if the people that were in power and the decision makers received letters, anonymous maybe, from every single woman who's experienced every single thing, detailing every single thing, their postbox would get very, very full very, very quickly. And if they had to read every single one, they might just begin to understand the depth and the width and breadth of what's actually still happening and make some change. So if you happen to know your MP's address and you feel inclined to write a letter or not drop an email, post a letter, because that's a physical thing, to drop through their box and tell them, then I would encourage that. So.
And talking of writing, something that we can do for ourselves is to write about these things, whether we send it out to anybody or not. And there was a question about whether While Women is still accepting poems with the Me Too hashtag and the Us Together, which Vic has answered, yes, they are. But there's also a question about how difficult was it writing about trauma in a creative way? Go, Vic.
For me, I found it much easier to write about than to live it. So it's sort of like actually putting it down on the page gave me some power over it, and I think Kim mentioned about the sort of white space around the experience. So, you know, particularly with writing Dog, that was kind of like, actually that was a really significant moment that kind of got brushed away from, you know, in life. So I think that I also, you know, I've run a lot of workshops. I think that if you're going to be writing this stuff, it's important to have support systems around you, because it can bring up a lot of things, you know. So whether that's physical support for yourself when you're writing, to make sure that you feel in a secure space, that where you're writing that material is safe, you know, it's not going to be exposed to anybody else unless you want to share it. If you can work in a group and you want to, then that can be great. But sometimes, you know, I did a lot of my writing on the loo, as I said in the poem. But, you know, if you need to be able to keep that safe. So.
I found writing about I remember writing the sequence in my first book about domestic violence, and about 10 poems in, getting really stuck. And I think looking back now, I'd basically gone too far back into my mind, into the actual experience, and it was like I couldn't get out. I ended up going to a therapist to sort of, not just so that I could put myself back together again, but because I wanted to write the poems. I wanted to finish the sequence as well. But I agree with Vic about keeping yourself safe, but one of the things that's always helped me is reading other women that are writing about violence and trauma, not necessarily the same types of violence as well, but just reading the women. I mean, we're lucky in our kind of generation that we've got these amazing female poets that have gone before us that we can learn from. We've got Pascal Petit and Renisa Alvey and you know, countless others that were, I mean, Pascal was writing, I've talked to her about it, she was writing on her own about this stuff. There wasn't many other women writers doing it at the same time. And I know it's a different type of trauma, but Wendy's another writer that I always read everything that she writes, because I think she just processes trauma in a different way in every single book. So I know it's a slightly different type of trauma you're writing about, Wendy, but yeah, so it's just finding other people that are doing the same thing. And for me, the once I've written it in a poem, I don't mind reading the poem out. It's like a little paper shield. I'd find it much more exposing if someone comes up to me, which I've also had a man come up to me and say, so what happened with that guy that hit you then? And I find that absolutely floored me, and it kind of re-traumatized me again. This guy saying, so did you go to hospital after the reading the poems doesn't bother me. They're like that's all I want to say on the topic in a way. But you can't be protected from those moments from unthinking audience members. Sorry, that's swiveled around the topic a lot, but
not at all. That's really interesting. And also, that top tip for any writer is to read before you write. Thank you for that, Kim. We're coming to the end of the session, and we do want to have one more poem before we finish. I don't think there are any personal survival tips from the audience, so that's something else you can think about. Put together your personal survival kit. So I'd like to say thanks once again to the Stay at Home Literary Festival for having us, and thanks of course to the poets Kim, Vic, Deborah and Wendy, and in spirit, I felt her here with us, Jill Mill Breckenridge. A reminder that all proceeds from this event, if you'd like to make a donation, and from sales of the book, go to Women's Aid. This is the book, the #MeToo anthology, if I can get it on the page. It's available from the festival bookseller. And we are going to finish with, I think it's the last poem in the book, isn't it? Spartacus by Pippa Little, read by Victoria Bennett.
Thanks. So just there's a little footnote with this. Spartacus was a rebel slave hunted down by the Romans to be crucified. Asked to identify by soldiers, everyone in the crowd around him stepped forward and said, "I am Spartacus." Spartacus. In the room, in the street, on the stair, where some men make free in plain sight or in secret as if we were sweet meat to dip fingers in and then forget. It is the being alone afterwards that numbs and maims, utterly alone in the silence of it, where shame creeps in, stuns dead. But now we rise, all women fondled and hurt and licked in acid jokery and in hate, pets, sweethearts, loves, darlings, humorless bitches. We stand together, each one a Spartacus, no longer silent or alone, each voice stronger, massing, alive, a wild murmuration of me too, me too, me too.